There's a moment that comes to everyone, though few recognize it when it arrives. You're sitting alone, perhaps in the early morning or late at night, and something feels different. Not dramatically different. Not the kind of shift that makes you want to call someone or post about it. Just a quiet awareness that something inside has begun to move. The world around you looks the same. Your circumstances haven't changed, but internally, imperceptibly, you are no longer who you were yesterday. And that realization, that subtle recognition of internal movement, is where silent transformation actually begins. Because the deepest changes in human psychology don't announce themselves with fanfare. They don't require witnesses or documentation. They whisper in moments of solitude, in the space between thoughts, in the choices you make when no one is watching. And most people miss them entirely because they're conditioned to believe that transformation should be loud, visible, celebrated. They're listening for thunder when real transformation sounds like breathing. We like to think of transformation as something observable, measurable, shareable. Declarations of intent, public commitments, visible milestones, the dramatic before and after reveal that proves change has occurred. But in truth, silent transformation is something entirely different. It's the dismantling of identity in the dark, when no one's watching, when there's no audience to perform for and no validation to receive. It's not about announcing change to make it feel real. It's about becoming someone different so gradually, so quietly, that even you don't notice the shift until one day you respond to life in a completely different way and realize the old version of you simply wouldn't have been capable of that response. And that kind of change, the deep internal kind that rewrites neural pathways and dissolves lifelong patterns, doesn't happen with fanfare or external pressure. It unfolds in stillness, in thoughts you consciously choose not to speak, in reactions you quietly refuse to have. Psychologists have long studied this phenomenon. Carl Jung called it the work in the darkness, the shadow integration that happens in the private depths of the psyche. Mindfulness researchers describe it as the silent rewiring of attention, where internal awareness shifts profoundly, while external behavior may not change for months. But beyond the theories, the truth is simple. The deepest transformation happens when you stop performing change for others and start living it in silence. Most people never experience this consciously. They confuse change with announcement, growth with visibility, evolution with performance. They post their goals before they've taken the first real step. They declare their intentions to create social pressure. They perform their healing journey for an audience, narrating every insight as if the telling makes it more true. And in doing so, they leak the psychological energy needed for actual internal restructuring. They're so busy broadcasting the journey that they never actually walk it. The transformation becomes a story they tell rather than a reality they live. This pattern runs deep, rooted in beliefs most people never question. I need accountability to change. If I don't tell people about it, it's not real. Transformation without evidence doesn't count. These beliefs sound like wisdom, like practical advice. But they become the very thing preventing deep change from taking root. Because silent transformation requires a kind of psychological privacy that our culture has forgotten to honor. It requires the willingness to evolve without applause, to heal without an audience, to become someone new in the sacred solitude of your own consciousness before you ever show that new self to the world. And that kind of change, that quiet revolution of the inner world, is what actually lasts. It's what actually rewrites identity at the level of the nervous system, the subconscious mind, the deep patterns that govern how you move through life. The psychology of silent transformation begins the moment you start observing yourself without needing to explain what you're seeing to anyone else. Not journaling it for potential publication, not discussing it with friends to process it externally, just noticing internally, privately, that something is shifting. You become aware of a pattern you've been running your entire life. You notice a belief that's been operating in the background. You feel an emotion arise and, instead of immediately externalizing it, you simply sit with it in silence and let it reveal what it came to teach you. This internal witnessing is the first act of sovereign change. It's the moment you stop being a character in someone else's narrative and start authoring your own internal story. Because once you can observe your patterns in silence, once you can sit with your thoughts and emotions, without needing to broadcast them or have them validated, you stop being fully controlled by them. The observation itself creates distance. The silence creates space. And in that space, choice becomes possible. Researchers studying the brain's default mode network have discovered something remarkable. Silent self-reflection creates deeper neural integration than talking about your experience. When you sit with change silently, when you allow internal shifts to happen without immediately explaining them, your brain creates more stable, more lasting rewiring patterns. The neural pathways that form in silence are less contaminated by others' interpretations, less influenced by the need to make your experience fit into a coherent narrative for external consumption. You are allowing your mind to restructure itself without the distortion of social expectations. And that kind of change is what actually lasts. It's not dependent on continued external validation. It's rooted in your own direct experience, integrated at a level deeper than language, deeper than story, deeper than the social self that performs for approval. But here's the paradox that stops most people before they ever begin. Most people want transformation to be witnessed, validated, celebrated by others. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that desire. We're social creatures, but psychologically speaking, the need for external validation during transformation is often the ego's way of maintaining control through social identity. Your sense of self resists silent change because if no one sees it happening, the socially constructed version of you fears it doesn't exist. That's why announcing goals feels safer than quietly pursuing them. The announcement creates witnesses. It locks you into a public identity. It gives your ego the illusion of having already changed, simply because you've declared the intention. But it also creates a trap, because now you're not just trying to change for yourself. You're trying to maintain consistency with the image you projected to others. You're performing transformation rather than living it. If you've ever told everyone about a big change you were going to make, then felt paralyzed by the weight of their watching eyes, you felt this resistance. If you've ever announced a goal and found yourself unable to pursue it naturally, because every action felt like a performance being evaluated, you know exactly what this feels like. But if you've ever kept a change completely private, worked on something in silence for months, and found that the work flowed more naturally, felt more authentic, sustained itself more easily, then you've touched the edge of silent transformation. Psychologists call this identity foreclosure. It happens when you commit to a public version of change before your internal self has actually shifted. You announce who you're becoming before you've done the private work of becoming that person. That gap creates psychological tension. It creates shame when you inevitably fall short. It creates exhaustion from constant performance. And eventually, most people resolve that tension by abandoning the change entirely, retreating back to the old identity that at least has the virtue of being familiar. That's why silent transformation doesn't begin with announcements or public declarations. It begins with the courage to change in the dark, to evolve without witnesses. Think about what this looks like in practice. If you announce you're becoming a writer before you've spent months writing in silence, you start performing the identity instead of living it. You curate posts about your process. You buy the aesthetic notebooks. You talk about the book you're going to write, but the actual work becomes secondary to the performance. Or consider someone who tells everyone they're on a healing journey. Suddenly, every insight gets packaged into a post. The actual integration, the quiet metabolizing of pain into wisdom, gets interrupted. But when you quietly start writing without telling anyone, when you show up to the blank page morning after morning with no one watching, the identity forms organically. When you process your pain in private journals that no one will ever read, the healing goes deeper. Silent transformation is identity formation in its purest form, undiluted by the need for social proof. This is why silent practices have such profound effects. Meditation where you sit with your own mind without discussing what arose. Private journaling where the pages will never be read. Long walks in solitude where thoughts unfold naturally. These create space for integration without performance. Once something integrates silently, it becomes unshakable. No one can talk you out of what you discovered in solitude, but the process is rarely visible even to you. Most people describe it as months of apparent stagnation, punctuated by sudden leaps in perception. You sit in silence for weeks and nothing seems to be happening. Then, without warning, something clicks. A belief suddenly reveals itself as optional. A pattern becomes visible and loses its power. This is the rhythm of silent transformation. Long periods of invisible work, followed by sudden shifts that are actually the result of accumulated hours of private attention. Psychology confirms this through what's called the incubation phase, where conscious effort stops, but unconscious processing accelerates. Integration happens beneath the surface. Then, when the internal work is complete, it surfaces naturally as changed behavior. What's interesting from a neuroscientific perspective is that the brain requires silence for this depth of change. During quiet solitude, the brain's default mode network activates more fully. This network is associated with self-reflection and personal narrative. It asks, who am I? What does my life mean? And it can only do this deep work when not constantly interrupted by external input. The transformation in these silent moments is measurable. It's the brain literally rewiring itself. So when people say someone changed overnight, what they're witnessing is the visible emergence of months or years of silent internal work. But here's the catch. People start the process. They feel early internal shifts. And then almost immediately they need to tell someone. They need to share the insight. They need to post about their breakthrough. And in that premature sharing, something essential gets lost. They say, I'm finally figuring myself out, but haven't sat with that understanding long enough for it to become embodied. They share the revelation while it's still fragile. And what happens? The person they share it with offers their interpretation, or their doubt, or their excitement that creates pressure. And suddenly, what was a private, organic process becomes a shared narrative you're now responsible for maintaining. The moment you speak transformation prematurely, you invite others' projections into your psychological space. The change becomes a debate instead of a lived experience. That's why silent transformation demands discernment about disclosure. Not secrecy, but sacred privacy. The ability to let something become real within you before exposing it to external opinion. It's like opening the cocoon to check on the butterfly. The observation itself disrupts the metamorphosis. Most self-improvement is loud, performative, external. Silent transformation is different. It's not about fixing yourself publicly. It's about integrating privately. Consider someone who struggles with anger. The loud approach is anger management classes, telling everyone you're working on it, performing calm. But silent transformation looks like sitting alone with your anger when it arises, without acting on it or suppressing it. Feeling the physical sensation and getting curious. When you meet anger with silent, compassionate attention, it reveals its message. You discover that beneath the rage is fear, or beneath the fear is grief, or beneath the grief is a violated boundary. And when that understanding happens in silence, the anger doesn't need to be managed anymore, because your psyche no longer needs it as a defensive strategy. In that sense, silent transformation is not self-improvement. It's self-revelation that happens in private. That's why private emotional processing is the cornerstone of silent transformation. You cannot silently transform what you immediately externalize. Emotions in silence are pure data. Anger without an audience is just energy seeking understanding. Sadness without performance is just grief asking to be felt. Studies found that people who process difficult emotions in private, before discussing them, show deeper psychological integration than those who immediately seek external validation. Feel first, integrate first. Then, if it's still relevant, share. But by the time you've actually felt and integrated an emotion in silence, there's often nothing left to share. The emotion has done its work. The most profound silent transformations happen in moments no one sees. You feel the urge to complain and choose silence. You notice judgment and let it pass without speaking it. You feel triggered and walk away quietly. You have an insight and let it sit for weeks. Each silent moment is a psychological revolution. They rewire your default responses without anyone knowing. When enough accumulate, the old reactive self dissolves. But this happens so slowly, so invisibly, that even people close to you might not notice for months. They just know something is different. You're calmer, more grounded. But they can't point to when it changed, because there was no announcement. You rarely notice silent transformation as it's happening. It's only in retrospective moments you realize how far you've traveled. You're in a conversation that would have triggered you 6 months ago, and you feel nothing but compassion. You're facing a situation that would have caused anxiety, and you're simply curious. You catch yourself responding to criticism with openness and think, when did that shift happen? You can't pinpoint the moment. There was just the accumulated weight of 1,000 private choices, the conversations you no longer need to have, the validation you no longer seek, the drama you no longer create. These are the invisible markers of silent transformation. No one throws you a party for outgrowing your need for external validation. But you know, in the quiet of your own awareness, you know you're not who you were, and yet there's always deeper silence to discover. Silent transformation doesn't end. It deepens. Every time you integrate something in silence, another layer reveals itself. Growth in silence never asks for recognition. It only asks for presence. The mind wants to announce each realization. The ego wants credit, but something deeper keeps choosing silence, keeps protecting the tender process of becoming, keeps trusting that what transforms you in private doesn't need an audience. What most people misunderstand is that transformation isn't about discipline or motivation. Those matter, but they're not the foundation. The foundation is awareness, an awareness so honest that it begins to dissolve the illusions you've been living within. When you see clearly, when you really see the mechanics of your own mind, the fears driving your choices, the narratives shaping your perception, you gain freedom. Not the kind that makes everything easy, but the kind that lets you choose differently, consciously, deliberately, even when every conditioned part of you is screaming to react the way you've always reacted. And that awareness only develops in silence. There's cognitive dissonance, the discomfort when your actions and beliefs don't align. Most people resolve this by changing their actions back to match their old beliefs. But those who experience true silent transformation do the opposite. They let the discomfort stay. They sit in the tension. They endure that in-between phase where nothing feels certain, where you're too aware to go back, but not yet confident in the new way. Where old friends still see you as you were. That liminal space is where the deepest work happens. That's where identity becomes independent of social validation. That's where you discover what you believe when no one else is in the room, and it's profoundly uncomfortable. But silent transformation requires that you stay in the middle, in the silence, in the not knowing, trusting the internal work is happening even when there's no evidence. One overlooked aspect is intentional solitude. We imagine we can transform while staying fully connected, but constant communication, social media, the need to stay available, all interrupt the silent processes required for deep change. If you're trying to transform but check social media constantly, you flood your neural space with others' narratives. You must create containers of undisturbed solitude. Turn off notifications. Take walks without podcasts. Sit with yourself without documenting it. You can't hear whispers in a nightclub. And transformation whispers, but the deeper layer isn't about external environment. It's about what you believe in private. Beliefs aren't just thoughts. They're instructions your nervous system follows, especially when held in silence. When you silently believe you're changing, without announcing it, your physiology shifts. Your posture adjusts. Your breathing deepens. It's the biology of internal conviction. Silent visualization creates more stable neural patterns than visualization that's immediately shared. You become what you silently practice being. Still, silent transformation isn't about hiding. It's about becoming. The distinction matters. The human psyche doesn't crave external recognition. It craves internal coherence. The feeling that who you are in private matches who you are in public. That's the paradox. It looks like withdrawal, but it's the process of becoming so integrated that you no longer need an audience to feel real. As children, we learn to perform ourselves for approval, but eventually that performance becomes exhausting. Silent transformation begins when you stop performing, even for yourself. You ask, who am I, when no one's narrative is imposed on me? You stop curating thoughts for potential sharing. You stop rehearsing how you'll describe your day. And from that perspective, silent transformation feels less like effort and more like relief. The relief of not having to explain yourself. Still, it requires courage, the kind that endures invisibility. Because changing silently means people will still see you as you were. You'll be misunderstood. You'll outgrow relationships without explaining why. That's normal. Silent growth often looks like withdrawal before it looks like emergence. But what you lose in immediate understanding, you gain in unshakable internal foundation. Unshakable internal foundation. Silent transformation isn't always recognized, even by you. Sometimes it looks like stillness, routine, ordinariness. To others, it might look like you're stuck. But internally, neural pathways are rewiring. beliefs dissolving, identity reorganizing. Growth doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes the deepest revolutions happen in the daily choice to sit with yourself in silence. And when silent transformation stabilizes, it feels less like achievement and more like remembering. You don't feel like you've become someone new. You feel like you've finally stopped pretending. The constant internal narration quiets. The need to justify fades. You respond from intuition. You move with groundedness that doesn't need external validation. That's psychological sovereignty. You stop performing your life and start living it. So if you find yourself changing in ways no one sees, know that you're not alone in this silence. Invisibility is not stagnation. It's incubation. Your psyche is doing work too deep for words, too sacred for social media. You don't have to explain yourself. You just have to keep showing up in the silence. Silence is the bridge between who you were told to be and who you actually are. The person you are becoming in silence is not the result of motivation or accountability. It's the result of every moment you chose internal truth over external approval. That's what silent transformation truly is. Not a withdrawal from the world, but a deepening into yourself so profound that when you do emerge, you're no longer performing who you think you should be. You're simply being who you actually are. It's not visible. It's not celebrated, but it's real. And that's all that matters.